William Thompson had always believed that success was measured by the things you could touch. The glossy surfaces of luxury cars, the weight of gold rings on your fingers, the towering skyscrapers you could call your own. He had spent decades in pursuit of these material milestones. And for him, life was nothing more than an ongoing race to the top. From a young age, he had learned to crave attention, validation, and power. His upbringing in a modest neighborhood had been filled with whispered dreams of grandeur, which he vowed to surpass the moment he had a chance. Now, in his early 40s, those dreams had come to life in the form of towering office buildings bearing his name, a penthouse overlooking the skyline, and a bank account overflowing with zeros. His empire, built on hard work and strategic moves, was the envy of those around him. There was nothing he didn't have and nothing he couldn't acquire. At least that's what he thought. His mornings began before the sun rose, with a cup of premium coffee brewed by a personal assistant in his sleek, modern kitchen. Each day was meticulously planned. Breakfast with business partners, lunch with potential investors, and evening meetings that stretched late into the night. Every decision he made was a calculated move toward wealth, status, and power. His social life was equally polished. At galas, he was the man everyone wanted to know, the one with the perfect balance of charm and mystery. He wore designer suits, drove the latest sports car, and dated beautiful women who fit his image of perfection. He had an impressive collection of watches, each one more expensive than the last, yet he barely noticed them as he glanced at his wrist. They had become little more than accessories to his life, marking the minutes as he moved relentlessly from one goal to the next. But beneath the polished exterior, a quiet emptiness gnawed at him. He had grown used to the feeling, brushing it aside like a passing thought. The loneliness of the boardroom, the superficiality of his friendships, the constant pursuit of something more, it was all part of the deal. William had long ago stopped questioning the meaning of it all. There were no answers. There were only results. At the top, everyone spoke the same language of success. The newest car, the largest house, the most exclusive membership. There was no room for doubt, no space for vulnerability. People liked him because of what he could give them. His wealth was his currency, and it bought him everything he needed, except, it seemed, true connection. His family had long since faded into the background. His parents, distant figures who had always pushed him to be someone, were proud but never truly understanding of who he had become. Their phone calls were brief and impersonal, conversations about taxes or the latest vacation home, but nothing deeper. His friends, too, had become more like business partners. They only called when they needed something, a loan, a connection, advice. Genuine moments of friendship were rare, and even when they did happen, there was always an undercurrent of expectation, a hidden agenda. Yet despite all this, William didn't question his life. He didn't wonder if something was missing. There was no time for that. He was too busy conquering the world, too consumed by the belief that more was always better. His idea of happiness was a simple equation. Wealth equals success, success equals happiness. It was all so clear to him, and in the midst of his carefully curated life, he never stopped to consider what would happen if it all came crashing down. The thought was unimaginable, almost laughable. After all, he had built this life from nothing. Why would it ever disappear? In his mind, failure was for other people, people who weren't as smart, as driven, or as focused as him. But what William didn't see was that he had built his empire on the shaky foundation of pride, ego, and an overwhelming need to prove something to the world. And in doing so, he had disconnected himself from the very things that could have made his life worth living. It all happened so suddenly that William didn't have time to react. One day, he was sitting at his desk, reviewing the numbers for his latest project, an ambitious venture into international markets that promised to skyrocket his already impressive fortune. He had made all the right moves, or so he thought. His team was confident, the data seemed solid, and everything appeared to be falling perfectly into place. But in the blink of an eye, it all unraveled. It started with a phone call, an urgent one from his chief financial officer. The tone in her voice told him something was wrong, but William, ever the optimist, brushed it off. It was probably a minor issue, he thought. After all, With everything else going so well, how could something small derail his plans? But as the day unfolded, the reality became clearer. A risky investment, one he had approved without properly vetting, had gone south. It was a multi-million-dollar gamble, a bet on the volatile energy market, and the market had crashed hard. The losses were staggering. Within hours, the news broke, and William's empire, the one he had carefully built, began to crumble. Shares plummeted, and creditors, who had once been eager to do business with him, now circled like vultures. Investors pulled their money out, and the bank began threatening to seize his assets. He watched in stunned silence as the phone rang nonstop. Each call a reminder that everything he had worked for was slipping away. There were no options left. His luxury apartments, his private jets, his fleet of cars, none of it mattered anymore. The empire he had constructed from sheer determination and clever maneuvering was disintegrating before his eyes. In the span of a few short weeks, the media descended on him with a ferocity he hadn't anticipated. Headlines screamed of his failure, painting him as just another greedy, reckless millionaire who had lost everything in his quest for more. The words stung like daggers, each one twisting deeper as the public watched in Schadenfreude. His name was no longer synonymous with success. It had become a cautionary tale of hubris and overconfidence. The phone calls stopped coming. The invites to high-profile events dried up. People who had once fawned over him now avoided his gaze, their smiles replaced by polite indifference. Worst of all, William was left alone in his towering penthouse, surrounded by wealth that no longer held any meaning. The grand furniture, the priceless artwork on the walls, these things, which had once been symbols of his success, now felt like cold, unwelcoming reminders of his failure. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. The extravagant dinners he had once hosted, the soirees with important business figures, seemed like relics from another life, one that was no longer his. His ex-wife, who had stayed with him for years, comforted by the lifestyle he provided, now stood at a distance. She had taken the children and moved out, as if to shield them from the mess he had become. Her parting words echoed in his mind, sharp and final. "I don't know who you are anymore, William. You're not the man I married." She had been right, he realized. In the pursuit of wealth, he had lost himself, his integrity, his values, and even his family. It was all gone. The nights grew longer, and the weight of despair pressed heavier on his chest. William tried to keep up appearances for a while, but the facade was slipping. He would go to business meetings that now seemed pointless, talking with investors who were too afraid to back him, nodding politely but never believing in the words he spoke. His sharp mind, which had once been able to see opportunities where others saw none, now struggled to come up with a single viable solution. His confidence was shattered, replaced by a quiet panic that grew with each passing day. He started avoiding the mirror. The man he saw reflected back at him was a stranger, someone he no longer recognized. His face, once filled with ambition and determination, was now pale and tired, the lines deepening from stress and sleepless nights. His sharp suit, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a costume he was unwilling to wear. He couldn't stand to walk into the boardrooms anymore, to face the people who used to look up to him with admiration and respect. Now, they looked at him with pity. In the midst of it all, there was a creeping fear that perhaps this collapse wasn't just financial. It was personal. His entire identity had been tied to his wealth and success. Now, with nothing left, who was he? As the walls of his world closed in, William did the only thing he could think of. He left. He couldn't stay in the city, not when every corner reminded him of his fall from grace. So, without much planning, he packed a few bags and booked a one-way ticket out of the city. The journey was meant to be an escape, an attempt to outrun the shame, the media frenzy, and his own self-loathing. He wasn't sure where he was headed, but somewhere deep inside, he knew that the man he was had to disappear. The problem was he didn't know who would emerge in his place. William's decision to leave the city wasn't so much a choice as it was a desperate attempt to flee from the suffocating weight of his failure. As he boarded the plane, he barely registered the details of his surroundings, just the hum of the engines and the distant chatter of passengers. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and he stared out of the window, watching as the city he had once ruled grew smaller and smaller below him. The skyscrapers, the luxury cars, the people who had once been his world, all faded into the distance, and with them, so did his identity. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in years, he didn't care. He had no appointments to keep, no deals to make, no meetings to attend. He had nothing left. His fingers drummed absently on the armrest, his mind racing through memories of what he had lost. His fingers felt cold, unfamiliar in a way, as though they weren't attached to the same body that had once worn a Rolex with pride or signed multi-million-dollar contracts without a second thought. By the time the plane landed in a small, sleepy town tucked away in the hills, William felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. There was no reason to be here. He had no family, no connections, and certainly no business interests in this place. He only knew that the city had become a prison for him, one built with the very wealth that had once given him freedom. And now, the only way to escape it was to leave everything behind, even if only for a short while. William rented a modest car at the small airport, his first taste of a life far removed from the ones he had grown used to. The drive through winding country roads was tranquil, the landscape so different from the harsh, cold edges of the city. The green hills seemed to whisper of simpler times, and though he couldn't fully explain why, it brought a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was the isolation, the anonymity, the fact that no one here knew him, or his name, or his wealth. For the first time in ages, he could breathe freely without the constant pressure to be something he wasn't. He found a small inn on the edge of town, a quaint building with flower boxes on the windowsills, tucked between a bakery and a local bookstore. It wasn't grand, and that was exactly what he wanted. A quiet room with a simple bed and a window that opened to the fresh country air. He spent the first few days wandering aimlessly through the town, doing his best to blend in with the locals. It was almost absurd how easily he could disappear here. No one stared at him. No one recognized him. He was just another face in a place where people lived without concern for the glossy world he had left behind. But it wasn't enough. The emptiness inside him hadn't vanished with the city's skyline. His thoughts circled back to his past, to his empire, to his ex-wife and children, to the life he had once known. He began to feel the sharp sting of loneliness in a way he had never allowed himself to before. In the city, he had been surrounded by people, yet none of them had truly seen him. Here, in the quiet of this small town, he was truly alone, and the weight of that loneliness seemed almost unbearable. It was on the fourth day that he stumbled across the cafe. It wasn't hard to miss. A cozy little spot, tucked away on a corner near the square, its windows fogged slightly by the warmth of the drinks inside. The sign above the door read, "The Hearth Cafe," in hand-painted letters. There was nothing remarkable about the place. No frills, no pretentiousness, just a simple, welcoming space. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, something about it called to him. Maybe it was the comforting smell of freshly brewed coffee, or the soft murmur of laughter spilling from within. Or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in a long while, William didn't feel the need to put up a front. He stepped inside, greeted by the warmth of the room and the gentle clink of cups and saucers. The cafe was filled with regulars, all chatting and laughing as they sipped their drinks. A few nodded in his direction, but no one stared. It was the kind of place where everyone felt like they belonged, regardless of who they were or where they came from. The walls were lined with local artwork, and a crackling fireplace added to the sense of coziness. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Behind the counter was a woman in her early 30s, wearing a simple apron and a kind smile. Her hair was tied up in a loose bun, and she was busy preparing an order as she glanced up at him. William hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he was even doing there. He didn't belong in a place like this. But the woman's gaze was warm and unassuming, and for reasons he couldn't quite place, he felt a flicker of something, perhaps hope or curiosity. "First time here?" she asked, her voice soft but with a grounded confidence that immediately put him at ease. William nodded. "Yeah, just passing through." She smiled, motioning to the menu above the counter. "Well, if you're looking for comfort, You can't go wrong with our caramel latte. It's a local favorite." He gave a small, uncertain laugh. "I'll take that then, thank you." As she prepared the drink, they exchanged a few pleasantries. Her name was Claire, and she owned the cafe. She spoke with an ease and warmth that made William feel as though he'd known her for years, even though they had just met. There was no judgment in her eyes, no curiosity about his past or his money. She treated him like any other person who needed a moment of peace. And for the first time in a long while, William felt a sense of belonging. He took his drink and found a seat by the window, watching the world go by. The peacefulness of the cafe, the warmth of Claire's smile, and the genuine kindness she had shown him were like a balm to his soul. It wasn't the solution to all his problems, but it was the first thing in weeks that made him feel human again. As the day wore on, and he finished his drink, William realized something. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about his losses, his failures, or the empty life he had left behind. He wasn't thinking about wealth or success or the hollow emptiness that came with them. For the first time, he was simply present in the moment. And for that, he was grateful. Over the next few days, William found himself returning to the Hearth Cafe every morning. What had started as a simple escape, a break from his relentless thoughts of loss and failure, gradually evolved into a routine that brought him a sense of purpose he hadn't known he needed. The more time he spent in the cafe, the more he became drawn to Claire, the owner who had so effortlessly made him feel at ease. She was nothing like the women he had known in his former life, polished, calculating, and always mindful of appearances. Claire was genuine, unpretentious, and deeply rooted in the community. She didn't care about the designer suits or the expensive watch on his wrist. She cared about people. Her conversations were effortless, filled with thoughtful questions and a quiet curiosity about others' lives. She had an uncanny ability to listen, to make people feel heard and understood without judgment. And in return, William found himself sharing parts of himself he had buried for years. One morning, after ordering his usual caramel latte, he sat down by the window, as he often did, watching the gentle flow of life in the town. Claire was behind the counter, making a fresh pot of coffee. As she did, she hummed a quiet tune, the kind of melody that could only come from someone who was comfortable in their own skin. William watched her for a few moments, realizing how rare it was to see someone so at peace, so unburdened by the world's expectations. She didn't seem to have the pressures of wealth or the weight of past mistakes hanging over her. Her life was simple, but in a way, it was also full. It was then that Claire approached his table, a small, warm smile on her face. "You know," she said, sliding a plate of freshly baked scones in front of him, "you've been coming here every day, but I've never actually asked you much about yourself. You're always so quiet when you're here." William took a deep breath. The truth was, he had been avoiding talking about himself. His story was one of loss and failure, and part of him was terrified that once he started, he might not be able to stop. But Claire didn't press him, her presence reassuring him in ways he couldn't explain. "I've just been thinking a lot lately," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Trying to figure things out." Claire nodded as if she understood, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, it was a rare kind of silence, one that invited reflection. Finally, she spoke again, her voice calm, but with a depth that made William look up. "Sometimes, we need to stop thinking so much and just feel the moment," she said, her eyes gentle but wise. "Life doesn't always have to make sense." Her words lingered in the air long after she returned to the counter. William stared down at his latte, the steam rising in gentle curls, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. He wasn't sure if it was the simple act of her kindness, or if it was the quiet reassurance of the cafe's homey atmosphere, but he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Here in this small town, far from his former life, he could breathe. He could just be. The following days saw more moments like that, small, seemingly insignificant exchanges that meant the world to William. He learned about Claire's life, her family, and the way she had built the Hearth Cafe from the ground up. She had worked tirelessly to create a space where people felt comfortable, where they could escape their own troubles, even if just for a little while. She wasn't driven by wealth or status. She was driven by a love of community, a passion for making others feel welcome and cared for. Claire's perspective on life was refreshing. She spoke of living simply, of finding joy in the little things, like a well-brewed cup of coffee or a good book, or the laughter of friends gathered around a table. To William, these things had always seemed trivial, distractions from the pursuit of something greater, more money, more success. But Claire's way of living slowly began to chip away at that mindset. She wasn't some naive dreamer. She was grounded, wise in a way that seemed to come from experience. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cafe, William found himself sharing more with Claire than he had ever shared with anyone. They sat together at a table near the fire, the soft glow of the flames casting a warm light over them as he told her about his rise and fall. He didn't mention the specifics, the deals, the investments, the lavish lifestyle, but he spoke of the emptiness he had felt, the loneliness that had taken root in him as he climbed higher and higher, only to watch it all crumble in the end. Claire listened intently, her gaze unwavering, not out of pity, but out of understanding. She didn't offer advice or try to fix him. She simply let him speak. And for the first time in what felt like forever, William allowed himself to be vulnerable. He felt the tears well up in his eyes, not because of what he had lost, but because he realized, for the first time, that he didn't have to be that man anymore. He didn't have to carry the weight of his past, his failures, or the expectations of others. He could start fresh. When he finished speaking, Claire reached across the table and placed a hand on his. It was a simple gesture, but it held more meaning than anything he had experienced in years. There was no judgment in her touch, no expectation, just compassion. "You're not alone, William," she said quietly. "And you're not defined by what you've lost. You're here now, and that's enough." Her words felt like a balm to his wounded soul. They weren't the words of someone trying to fix him, but of someone who understood the messy, complicated nature of life. It was a truth that William had buried deep inside him, one that he had forgotten in the rush to accumulate wealth and power, that he was enough as he was, without the titles or the money. In that moment, William realized that the true meaning of success wasn't in the assets or the achievements. It was in the connections we make, the kindness we offer, and the peace we find within ourselves. And here, in this small town, in this humble cafe, he was starting to rediscover that truth. William woke up early the next day, the soft, golden light of dawn filtering through the small window in his modest room above the cafe. He lay there for a moment, the weight of the silence in the room settling over him. It was the kind of silence he had feared in his previous life, the kind that made him confront the emptiness he had lived with for years. But here, in this quiet town, it felt different. It felt peaceful. The world outside seemed to be waking up with him, the birds chirping in the trees and the scent of fresh earth filling the air. He dressed slowly, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. For the first time in a long time, he felt the freedom to move at his own pace. He didn't need to rush to a boardroom meeting or make calls to close deals. He didn't need to prove anything. All that mattered in this moment was that he was here alive, breathing, and beginning to rebuild. When he arrived at the Hearth Cafe, the sun had fully risen, and Claire was already behind the counter, her apron tied neatly and her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She greeted him with a smile, and the warmth in it immediately soothed him. It was the kind of smile that felt like home, like safety, and for a brief second, William allowed himself to just soak it in. "Morning," Claire said, wiping her hands on a towel as she looked up at him. "How are you today?" For the past few days, she had asked him the same question, but today it felt different. There was a subtle change in the air, an unspoken understanding between them. William wasn't sure what had shifted, but something within him felt lighter. The burden of his past, the relentless drive to achieve more, had begun to fade into the background. "I'm good," he said, his voice quieter than usual. But there was something in his words, a sincerity, a quiet contentment that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking a lot lately about everything." Claire nodded, her gaze soft but perceptive. "I can tell. Sometimes it takes a while for the dust to settle, doesn't it?" William smiled slightly. She was right. The dust was still settling, but it no longer felt like a storm. It felt like a gentle breeze, carrying away the remnants of his old life, leaving behind only what mattered. He wasn't sure yet what that would look like, but he knew it would be something different, something better. That afternoon, as the cafe filled with the familiar hum of conversation and clinking cups, William found himself organizing the back room, something he had never thought of as important before. It was a simple task, stacking boxes and cleaning shelves, but it gave him a sense of purpose. For years, he had been consumed by the idea of success in the form of grandiose achievements. But here, in this small town, William was learning the value of the small, the steady, and the simple. Later, as the cafe emptied and the evening sun began to set, Claire joined him behind the counter again. The cafe was quiet, save for the soft murmur of the radio playing in the background. She leaned against the counter, her gaze flicking to the half-empty cup of tea in front of her. "I've been thinking," she said after a moment of silence, "about how you keep coming back here. I know this wasn't what you planned for when you first came to town." William paused, his hands stilling for a moment as he wiped down the counter. He had never really talked about his reasons for staying in the town, or why he kept coming back to the cafe. It wasn't because he had nothing else to do. It was because, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to rush. He didn't feel the pressure to achieve anything. "I didn't expect to stay this long," he admitted, his eyes meeting hers. "But there's something about this place. It feels right, you know? It feels like the kind of place where I can just be myself, without pretending, without being who everyone expected me to be." Claire smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a quiet understanding. That's the beauty of it, isn't it? The simplicity of just being here in the moment, without all the noise. William let out a deep breath, the weight of the past few months sinking in. He realized, in that moment, how much he had changed. This small town, and Claire, had shown him that success wasn't measured by wealth or status. It was about finding joy in the small things, the quiet moments, the shared smiles, the unexpected connections. "I don't know what the future holds," he said softly, his voice filled with a new kind of hope. "But I'm starting to think that maybe this is enough. Just being here, with you, and finding peace in the everyday." Claire's smile softened, and for a moment, they just stood there in the quiet comfort of the cafe. The world outside carried on, but in this little corner, time felt like it had slowed down, allowing both of them to just exist. After a moment, Claire picked up a napkin and scribbled something on it before handing it to William. "This might be a bit unconventional," she said, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief, "but I think you should keep this in mind as you figure things out." William took the napkin and unfolded it. Written on it was a simple phrase: "It's not about finding the perfect path. It's about walking the one in front of you." He stared at the words, feeling something shift inside him. Maybe this was the lesson he needed to learn. The path forward wasn't about knowing everything, about having a grand plan. It was about taking each step with intention, with presence, and without fear of the unknown. "I think I'll remember that," he said, looking back at Claire. "You will," she replied with a smile that seemed to light up the room. "We all just need a reminder sometimes." The days in the small town had started to feel like a blur, but in the best way possible. William was no longer counting hours or measuring success by the number of tasks he completed. He found himself waking up with a quiet excitement, ready to face another day, even if it meant more of the same. Cleaning tables, serving coffee, or talking with the regulars who had become a surprising part of his life. In the weeks that followed, his relationship with Claire evolved in subtle, yet significant ways. They spent more time together, sometimes after hours when the cafe was empty, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes the conversation was light, about the weather or the peculiarities of small-town life. Other times, it was deeper, with Claire sharing stories of her past, of the hardships she'd overcome, the family she'd lost, and the lessons she'd learned. William listened intently, admiring her resilience and her ability to find joy in the simplest moments. One evening, after a particularly busy day, William was wiping down the counter, his hands moving mechanically as his thoughts wandered. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Claire was at the back of the cafe, cleaning up the kitchen. He had come to know the rhythm of her movements, how she worked with a quiet grace, never rushing but always efficient. A sudden thought struck him. He had never truly asked about her dreams, about the life she envisioned for herself. In all their conversations, he had been focused on his own journey of rediscovery. But now, as he stood there in the cafe that had become his new home, he realized how little he knew about the woman who had been by his side through it all. "Claire," he called out, his voice breaking through the quiet hum of the cafe. She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What about you? What do you want?" She paused for a moment, her eyes meeting his, a trace of surprise in her expression. It was a question she had probably never considered for herself, at least not in a long time. The lines around her eyes softened as she walked over to the counter and leaned against it, her gaze turning inward for a moment. "I guess I've never really thought about it," she admitted. "When you're focused on getting through the day, it's easy to forget what you actually want. You just keep going, keep surviving." Her words hit William in a way he hadn't expected. He understood the weight of survival. He had spent most of his life in the same mode, driven by the need to succeed, to stay ahead, to not let anything slip through his fingers. But here, in this small town with Claire, he was learning that survival wasn't enough. There had to be more. There had to be a reason to live beyond the grind. "But you've got to have dreams, right?" He pressed gently, his voice sincere. Claire gave a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Maybe, but right now, I'm just happy doing what I do here. It's enough for me." William found himself nodding, a sense of understanding settling over him. There was peace in Claire's simplicity, in her ability to find contentment in the present without always chasing something bigger. He admired it, and for the first time, he wasn't sure whether he needed something more either. As the evening stretched on, and the cafe grew quieter, William and Claire found themselves sitting at the same table where they had shared so many other moments. He poured them both a cup of coffee, the steam rising in gentle swirls. The sound of the clock ticking in the corner was the only noise between them. "I used to think that happiness came from achievements," William said quietly, almost to himself. "I thought it was about getting ahead, building something that everyone would admire. But now, I don't know. I think maybe it's about connection, about finding a place where you're seen, really seen, and where you can just be." Claire looked at him then, her eyes filled with something soft and unspoken. "That's what we all want, isn't it? To be seen, to matter, to know that we're part of something bigger." The words lingered between them, and in that silence, something shifted. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no grand gesture or revelation. But in that quiet space, they both knew that they had found something important. They had found each other, not as a way to fill the empty spaces in their lives, but as a mutual understanding that life was about the connections we made, the people we chose to share it with. As the night deepened, Claire stood up, walking over to the window to glance outside at the quiet street. "I guess we all get to decide what we want from life, even if we don't know it at the time," she said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it takes a little while to figure it out." William stood and joined her, looking out at the town. The streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the buildings. The town seemed peaceful, unhurried, a place where time didn't feel like an enemy, but a companion. For the first time in years, William felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. He wasn't in control of everything, and that was okay. He didn't have a clear path ahead of him, but he was willing to walk down it, step by uncertain step, as long as he had something worth walking toward. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm starting to see that." Claire smiled at him, her expression warm and knowing. "We're all figuring it out, one day at a time." William woke up to the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the cafe below. The usual morning routine had become comforting, a ritual that anchored him in this new life he was building. He stretched lazily, feeling the quiet of the room settle around him. And as he got dressed, he felt the weight of the day ahead less pressing than it had ever been before. When he made his way down the stairs and into the cafe, he found Claire already there, bustling about in her usual way, arranging the baked goods on display and tidying up the counter. There was a quiet energy about her that he had come to admire, the way she moved through the world with such grace, never hurrying but always purposeful. William realized that he had begun to look forward to these moments with her, not as a distraction from his past life, but as something vital to his present. Morning, Claire greeted him with her usual smile, her eyes bright as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. "You're up early. Sleep well?" William nodded, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him. The warmth of the mug against his palm felt grounding. "Yeah, actually, better than I have in a long time." "That's good to hear," she said, taking a seat across from him at the counter. There was a moment of silence between them, the kind that was comfortable and filled with unspoken understanding. Claire seemed to sense that William had something on his mind. She leaned forward, her eyes meeting his with a steady calm. "You've been quiet the past few days," she observed. "Is everything all right?" William hesitated, not because he didn't want to talk to her, but because he wasn't entirely sure how to articulate what he was feeling. He had been mulling over something, an idea that had been forming in the back of his mind. It wasn't something he had planned or expected. But now, sitting here with the hum of the cafe in the background, it felt like the right moment to say it out loud. "I've been thinking about making a change," he said slowly, his voice almost uncertain. "I've been here for a while now, and it's been good, better than I ever imagined. But I'm starting to wonder if maybe I should do something more. I mean, not with my old life, but with this. Here, maybe I could stay longer than I thought. Maybe even build something here." Claire raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Build something? Like what?" William took a deep breath, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I don't know yet. Maybe something to help the town. I don't want to just be a visitor here. I want to be part of it. I don't want to drift anymore, just passively watch life go by." Claire's expression softened, and for a moment, she simply regarded him, as if weighing his words. "I think that's a good idea," she said quietly. "You've already started to change, William. But I think it's more than just finding peace here. You're discovering that you can contribute, that you have something to offer." William's chest tightened at her words. They resonated with him, echoing something deep within. It wasn't just about finding happiness. It was about actively participating in life in a way that aligned with who he was becoming. He looked out the window, his thoughts drifting to the town, the people he had come to know, the quiet but steady rhythm of life that played out in the streets. It wasn't the fast-paced, high-stakes world he had come from, but maybe that was the point. Maybe this slower, gentler pace was exactly what he needed to begin truly living. "I don't know exactly what that looks like yet," he said thoughtfully, "but I think I want to start by helping people here. People like you, people who've built something worth holding on to." Claire smiled at his words, but there was a hint of something else in her gaze, something proud and knowing. "You know, you've been a huge help around here already. You got a knack for making people feel comfortable, like they belong. You're already making a difference, William. Just by being here, by being yourself." He felt a warmth spread through him at her compliment. It wasn't grand, nor was it the kind of praise he was used to from his old world. But it was real, and it felt more significant than anything he had ever received. "I guess," William continued, "I just want to do more. I'm tired of running from things. I want to build something that actually matters." Claire nodded, her gaze distant for a moment, as if she was thinking deeply about something. "You know, I've often thought about what I could do if I had more resources," she said quietly. "There's always a need here, things that could be better if there was more support. But it's hard to do that on your own." The weight of her words hung in the air between them. William's mind raced. He had the resources to make a real difference, but he had always been hesitant to use his wealth in ways that weren't about personal gain. This time, though, it felt different. He didn't need the grand gestures or the recognition. He needed something meaningful, something that connected him to this place, to these people. "What if I helped?" he asked, his voice steady now. "What if we worked together on something? Something that gives back to the town? Maybe a community fund or a center for people who need a place to go. We could make a real difference." Claire's eyes softened, and she sat up straighter. "That's an idea. I think it could work. It could help a lot of people who've been overlooked." William's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt alive with purpose. This wasn't about restoring his image or repairing his reputation. This wasn't even about his past mistakes or regrets. It was about creating something of lasting value, something that aligned with the person he was becoming. As the morning turned into afternoon, they talked about the possibilities. They brainstormed ideas for projects, figuring out the logistics and what would be needed to start. With every passing moment, William felt his sense of hope and purpose grow stronger. He wasn't just running from his past anymore. He was moving forward slowly but surely, building something new. William stood in the middle of the cafe, a map of the town spread out on the table in front of him. Claire was beside him, tapping her pen against the paper thoughtfully as they outlined the project that was starting to take shape. The small town streets, with their quaint shops and humble homes, were no longer just a place where William was hiding out. They had become a canvas, a place where he could begin to build something meaningful. "What do you think?" Claire asked, leaning closer, her voice soft but filled with the confidence that had become one of her defining traits. "Is this something we can start with? A community space, a resource center for families, maybe a place where people can gather, find support, get advice?" William looked at the plan they'd drawn up, an empty lot not far from the cafe, with enough room for a building that could serve multiple purposes. It wasn't much yet, just an idea, but it was a start. The thought of actually seeing it come to life made his heart race with anticipation. This wasn't about charity. It wasn't about pity. It was about community, about giving people a place where they could belong, a safe haven from the uncertainties of life. "I think it's perfect," William said, his voice steady. "But we need a lot more than just a building. We need a team, resources, people who can make it happen. I have some connections that might help, but we'll need more than just funds to make this work." Claire's eyes sparkled with excitement. "We got this. You've already made a big impact just by being here. People are starting to see you differently, William. You've become a part of this place, not just a visitor. The town trusts you now." William was still grappling with the fact that after everything he'd been through, he could now be seen as someone who had earned trust, not just for his wealth or status, but for who he was becoming. It was humbling, and more than that, it was empowering. "You really think so?" he asked, surprised at the depth of her belief in him. Claire smiled, her eyes warm. "I know so. You've changed. And the people here, they've seen that change. They're ready to support you, ready to be part of this." William felt a swell of gratitude. It had been so long since he'd felt like he belonged anywhere. The thought that he could actually help people, that they were ready to trust him, was more than he had ever hoped for. Over the next few days, the two of them worked tirelessly on their plans, reaching out to local businesses, meeting with potential collaborators, and brainstorming ideas. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and even frustrations. But each time they hit a roadblock, they found a way to push forward. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, as they sat in the cafe, sorting through a pile of papers, William paused and looked at Claire, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity. "This isn't just about the center," he said slowly. "It's about starting over. For both of us." Claire looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean that when I came here, I was broken," he said, his voice soft but sure. "I didn't know what I was doing, or even if I could start again. I was running from everything. But now, with this project, with you, I'm realizing that I can build something real. I can make a difference, not just for the town, but for myself too. I'm not just trying to fix my mistakes anymore. I'm creating something new, a new life, a new future." Claire's expression softened, and she reached across the table, placing her hand on his. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the world had shifted in that moment. There was no need for words, just a shared understanding that they were both embarking on something that was far beyond anything they had imagined when they first met. "I'm glad you're here, William," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of years of struggle and strength. "And I'm glad you're doing this, for yourself, for us, and for the people who need it. It's never too late to start over. And I think you're finally starting to see that." William felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't just the weight of her words. It was the truth behind them. He had been running for so long, trying to outrun the consequences of his past, the failures he could never quite escape. But here, in this small town with Claire, he was learning that the best way to move forward was not to keep looking back. It was to build, to create, to give. Over the following weeks, the town rallied around the project. The community center began to take shape, brick by brick, piece by piece. William's role had evolved. No longer just the man with the checkbook. He had become a partner, a collaborator, working side by side with Claire and the townspeople to bring their vision to life. One evening, as they stood outside the building site, looking at the progress they'd made, William turned to Claire. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the construction area. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "I mean, it's real. It's happening." Claire smiled, her hand resting comfortably in his. "I told you, you were ready for this. You just had to see it for yourself." William looked at her, his heart full. "I don't think I could have done it without you, Claire. You've helped me find something I didn't even know I was looking for." She tilted her head, her eyes soft and knowing. "You found it all along, William. You just needed to stop running from yourself." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, William stood beside Claire, a sense of peace settling over him. The future was uncertain, yes, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came next, he knew he had a purpose now. And with Claire by his side, he was ready to face whatever the next chapter might bring. As the weeks went by, the construction of the community center gained momentum. The skeletal frame of the building was no longer just an outline of what could be. It was becoming a place that was filled with purpose. William had always been accustomed to working in high-stakes environments, where everything moved quickly and every decision had far-reaching consequences. But this was different. Every brick, every nail, every piece of timber felt like a piece of his own soul being poured into something new, something that could stand the test of time. One morning, after a long day of overseeing progress on the site, William and Claire sat on the steps of the unfinished building, the sound of hammers and saws echoing around them. The air was cooler than usual, and the sky above was beginning to darken, signaling the approach of another storm. It had been a day filled with minor setbacks, miscommunications with the contractor, delays in the delivery of materials. But William felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in years. "Do you ever feel like we're on the edge of something big?" William asked, his voice thoughtful as he stared out at the town, the hills rolling in the distance. Claire glanced at him, her face illuminated by the soft light of the fading sun. "I do," she replied with a smile. "But I think we're already in it. This project, this whole journey, it's already bigger than we realized." William let her words sink in. In his former life, he had been surrounded by grand visions, huge business deals, and markets that spanned the globe. But here, in this small town, everything felt more grounded, more real. He wasn't chasing an empire or seeking approval anymore. He was building something that mattered to people, something that could help them heal, find strength, and grow. "Sometimes," he began, his voice carrying a weight of reflection, "I think back on how I used to measure success. It was always about more money, more power, more influence. But now I see that the things I thought were the most important, they were just distractions." Claire nodded, her expression softening as she listened intently. "That's part of what makes you different now, William. It's not about the more, it's about the right kind of more. More connections, more meaningful relationships, more purpose." He was quiet for a moment, turning his head to look at her. She had a way of simplifying things, cutting through the noise and finding what truly mattered. It was part of why he had come to rely on her not just as a partner in this venture, but as someone who had become a stabilizing force in his life. "I don't know if I would have believed that a few months ago," he admitted, his voice carrying a hint of awe. "If you'd told me that I'd be here, working with you on something like this, I would have thought you were crazy." She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "I think you might have thought I was a little crazy back then. You weren't exactly looking for meaning in your life." He chuckled, the sound genuine and warm. "Yeah, well, I was too busy chasing the wrong things. It's funny how life has a way of nudging you in the right direction, even when you're too stubborn to see it." Claire's smile faded slightly, her gaze turning inward as she spoke. "You know, sometimes I think we all need a wake-up call, something that shakes us to our core so we can finally see the truth. I know I needed it too." William turned his full attention to her now, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean? What was your wake-up call? She took a deep breath, the light breeze tugging at the ends of her hair. I've spent so much of my life taking care of others, running the cafe, managing the needs of the town, because it was easier to pour myself into everyone else's problems than to face my own. But when I realized I wasn't really living my own life, when I had nothing left to give because I'd ignored my own needs, that's when I knew I had to change. William could feel the weight of her words settle in the space between them. The vulnerability in her voice, something he hadn't expected. Claire had always seemed like a pillar of strength, but hearing her admit that she, too, had faced her own struggles made him feel even more connected to her. It reminded him that they were both on journeys of healing, of rediscovery. I think we're both learning to be braver, William said quietly. Braver about facing what's been holding us back, and braver about building something new, even if it's scary. Exactly, Claire agreed, her voice soft but firm. We're not just building a center for the town, we're building a new way of living. For both of us. The sound of a distant horn from a truck pulling up interrupted the moment, signaling the arrival of more supplies. Claire stood up first, brushing off her jeans as she offered William a hand. Come on, she said with a smile. Let's get to work. They spent the next few hours walking the site, finalizing plans and overseeing small details that would help push the project closer to completion. Even in the midst of all the chaos, there was a sense of calm between them, a mutual understanding that they were in this together, no matter the obstacles. As they wrapped up for the evening, standing in the dim light with the half-completed building behind them, William turned to Claire, his expression a mixture of admiration and gratitude. I couldn't do this without you, Claire. I don't think I could have gotten this far without your belief in me. Claire's smile was soft and sincere. And you don't have to. We're in this together. As they walked back toward the cafe, side by side, William felt a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He had found something worth fighting for, something that wasn't based on power, wealth, or success. It was about creating a legacy that meant something to the people around him. It was about starting over, not just for himself, but for a community that had welcomed him in. And most of all, it was about the person beside him, the woman who had helped him see that the best things in life weren't the ones you could buy, but the ones you could build. As the evening sky grew darker and the stars began to twinkle above, William walked beside Claire with a renewed sense of hope, knowing that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The days seemed to blur together as the opening of the community center loomed ever closer. William had thrown himself into the final push with a single-mindedness that was both invigorating and exhausting. It felt like everything he had built in his past, his wealth, his success, the empire he had once controlled, had been leading him to this moment, not for accolades or recognition, but for something far more profound, the opportunity to truly create something lasting, something meaningful, something that could make a real difference in people's lives. But it wasn't just about the building. William knew, deep down, that the community center had come to symbolize more than just a place for people to gather. It was a reflection of his own transformation. In the past, he had been driven by numbers and status, constantly pushing forward, always seeking the next big deal. Now, every corner of the center, every decision made, carried weight. It was a new kind of achievement, one built on connection, on purpose, on helping others. As the days passed, Claire's presence beside him was an anchor he hadn't realized he needed. They worked late into the evenings, poring over the final details. The scent of freshly printed flyers filled the room as Claire ran through her notes, occasionally looking up at him with that knowing smile that seemed to carry 1,000 unspoken words. It was as though they were now in tune with each other, communicating without the need for much else. William had always been a man of action, driven by ambition. Yet, there was something so grounding in the way Claire approached everything with patience. Her quiet confidence had become a counterbalance to his own restlessness, and he was beginning to realize just how much he depended on her, not just in the context of the project, but in his life as a whole. Late one evening, after another long day spent finalizing last-minute details, William and Claire found themselves alone in the empty community center. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the polished floors, a stark contrast to the construction site that had once been filled with noise and chaos. The building was almost complete, the final touches being applied, the space already beginning to feel alive with possibility. "I can't believe we're here," William said quietly, his voice thick with emotion as he stood in the middle of the large, open hall. The space felt expansive, yet warm, a blend of hope and history, a place where people could come together and build something bigger than themselves. "Yeah," Claire said, her voice just as quiet but filled with a steady sense of pride. "We did it." William looked over at her, his gaze lingering for a moment. The way she spoke those words, "we did it," made something shift inside him. It wasn't just a statement about the center. It was a reflection of everything they had built together. The trust, the hard work, the quiet moments of vulnerability they had shared along the way. "You know," he began, his voice hesitant, "this project, it's been more than just a way to rebuild the town for me. It's been a way to rebuild me. I'm not the same person who walked in here months ago. I'm not even sure who that person was anymore." Claire's expression softened, and she took a few steps toward him, her hand brushing against his as if to ground him in the moment. "You're not supposed to be the same person," she said quietly. "That's the point. We all have our own stories, our own journeys. We change, we grow, and sometimes we don't even notice it until we're standing on the other side of it." He nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He had been so focused on the external, on the grand gestures and accomplishments, that he hadn't fully recognized how much the process of building the community center had also been about personal growth. He wasn't the man he had been when he first arrived in the town, but that didn't scare him. "Sometimes I still think I don't deserve this kind of change," William admitted, his voice low. "I've made so many mistakes in my life, so many people I've hurt. I'm not sure I'll ever fully make up for it." Claire's eyes met his with a quiet, unwavering understanding. "You're human, William. You've made mistakes. We all have. But you're also learning. You're not running from your past anymore. And you're trying to build something that matters. That's all anyone can ask of you." There was a moment of silence, the weight of her words settling in the air between them. William felt something stir within him, a deep, quiet understanding of the journey he had been on. It wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't even about fixing what had been broken. It was about moving forward, about choosing to be a better version of himself every day. As the storm outside picked up, the rain beginning to pour in heavy sheets against the windows, Claire stepped closer to him, her presence calming, grounding. "We've come so far," she said softly, "but there's still so much ahead of us." Together, the words felt like a promise, and William found himself drawn to her in a way that was both unfamiliar and reassuring. He had never imagined that something as simple as working on a community center could shift the very core of his being. But in this moment, standing beside Claire in the nearly finished building, he realized that the center wasn't the only thing being built. His future, his real future, was just beginning to take shape too. "Together," he repeated, his voice filled with quiet determination. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what the future might bring. Whatever challenges they faced, whatever obstacles came their way, he knew that with Claire by his side, they would find a way to face them. They were building something real now, something that could withstand the test of time, something based on trust, on mutual respect, and on the love that had slowly blossomed between them. As the storm raged on outside, the warmth of the community center wrapped around them like a shield, a symbol of all the possibilities that lay ahead. The morning of the grand opening arrived with a crispness in the air that seemed to mirror the excitement bubbling up inside William. He stood at the front of the newly completed community center, surveying the final touches that had been made overnight. Polished floors that gleamed in the sunlight, fresh plants lining the windowsills, banners with the center's name proudly displayed along the walls. It felt unreal. A year of sweat, struggle, and quiet perseverance had led him to this moment. And though he had faced countless doubts and challenges along the way, he stood there now, a sense of quiet pride filling his chest. The community center wasn't just a building. It was a testament to his transformation. The place had evolved from a blueprint on a drawing board into a vibrant space that now stood as a symbol of resilience, of change, and of hope for the town that had seen both the rise and fall of his life. William's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to find Claire walking toward him, her smile warm, her eyes sparkling with the same excitement he felt but tempered with the grace that had become so familiar to him. She looked radiant in a simple dress, but the strength in her presence made it clear she had become more than just his partner in this venture. She was now a cornerstone of his life. "You did it," Claire said softly as she joined him, her eyes scanning the space just as his had moments before. "We did it," William corrected gently, a quiet smile on his lips. Claire met his gaze, her expression softening as she looked at him with the kind of tenderness he had never expected to find again. This woman, who had once been a stranger, now felt as if she were part of him, intertwined in a way that was deeper than anything he had known. She was the calm that had steadied him when the storm inside him raged, the strength that had pushed him to see this project through to the end. It wasn't just the work they had done together. It was the way she had helped him rediscover who he was, how she had helped him find joy in the small things again. As the doors opened and townspeople began to filter in, William felt a swell of emotion he hadn't expected. He had been so focused on making this moment perfect, on rebuilding his life and his reputation, that he hadn't anticipated how much this space and the people it served would mean to him. Faces he had once ignored, people he had once overlooked, now filled the room. He greeted them with a mixture of gratitude and wonder, each handshake, each conversation carrying weight. It wasn't just about the community center anymore. It was about rejoining the fabric of this town, about reconnecting with the people he had once abandoned in his pursuit of success. "William, thank you so much for this," said an elderly woman, her eyes wet with emotion as she gazed around the room. "You've done more than just build a place for us to meet. You've given us a home again." William's throat tightened at the sincerity in her voice. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like an outsider in this town. He felt as though he belonged here, in this humble space, surrounded by people who now saw him not just as the millionaire who had lost everything, but as someone who had built something real, something that mattered. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words feeling too small to encompass everything he felt. "This is for all of you." Claire was by his side the entire time, quietly offering support, managing the flow of people, and effortlessly making everyone feel welcome. She was the heart of this place, and William knew it. The way she connected with others, the way she made them feel seen, it was a gift. He had watched her over the past months, how she moved through the town, how she gave her time and her care to each person she met. And he had learned from her. He had learned what it meant to truly care, not just for the project, but for the people who would use it. As the day wore on, the community center filled with laughter, conversation, and a palpable sense of hope. There were children running through the halls, their laughter echoing off the walls, a reminder of how much life had been breathed into the building. People of all ages gathered, sharing stories, making plans, finding new connections. It was everything William had hoped for, and more. The center wasn't just a physical space. It was a living, breathing entity that would continue to evolve, adapt, and grow, just as the people it served would. By the time the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the bustling center, William found himself standing outside, looking up at the building. There was a peacefulness in the air now, a sense of completion. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was everything he had needed and more. "Claire," he said, turning to her, "I think we did something incredible here. Not just for the town, but for us too." She smiled, her eyes soft with emotion. "Yes, we did. And it's just the beginning." The weight of her words settled in, a truth that resonated deep within him. This community center was just one chapter in their story. It wasn't the end. It was only the start of something much bigger, a new journey for both of them. As they stood there, side by side, William felt a deep sense of peace, a peace he hadn't known in years. He had lost everything once, but now he had found something he could never lose, a purpose, a place to belong, and, most importantly, a love that made all of it worth fighting for. Together, they had opened the doors to a new future. And this time, he was ready to walk through them. The night after the opening was a quiet one. William had stayed behind for a while, lingering in the now empty community center as the last few people trickled out. The space, once echoing with the sounds of laughter and conversation, was now peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights outside. It was surreal, this stillness, as if the building itself was breathing, absorbing all the emotions of the day. And William felt it deeply, as if the weight of all he had lost and all he had found had settled into his very bones. As he locked the door behind him and stepped out into the cool night, he saw Claire standing at the edge of the parking lot, gazing up at the stars. Her figure was silhouetted against the soft, fading light, her posture relaxed, as though she had been waiting for him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said without turning, her voice carrying a quiet wonder. "The way everything feels so, right?" William joined her, standing side by side, both of them simply taking in the sight. The community center, now full of life, felt like the culmination of their dreams, a dream they had built together, brick by brick. "It is," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "I never imagined it would feel like this. This, complete." They stood in silence for a while longer, just letting the night envelop them. The world was still, and in that stillness, something shifted in William's heart. This was the moment he realized that everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, had brought him to this very place. Not just in terms of the center, but in his life, in his relationship with Claire, in the way he had come to understand what truly mattered. "Claire," he began, his voice tentative, as if the words had been waiting for the right moment to come out, "I never expected any of this. I never expected you." She turned to him then, her expression soft but knowing. "I think you're exactly where you need to be, William. We both are." He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. There was something unspoken between them, a connection that had deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated. "I don't know what the future holds," William said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty, yet laced with hope, "but I want you to be a part of it. Not just here with the center, but in my life. In everything." Claire's eyes softened, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her smile. "I think we both have a lot to discover about what comes next," she replied, her voice tender. "But I'm willing to take that journey with you." William's heart swelled with emotion. He had spent so many years chasing wealth, status, and success, thinking that those were the things that would define him. But now, standing beside Claire, in this place that they had built together, he realized the truth. It wasn't the riches or the accomplishments that made a life worth living. It was the people. It was the connections. It was love, the kind that asked for nothing but gave everything. He took her hand, and they walked together toward the center, side by side. The building loomed ahead of them, its windows reflecting the light of the stars above. It was no longer just a structure made of brick and mortar. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for, of the healing, the growth, the chance to start over. And as they stood together at the entrance, William felt something settle within him. He wasn't the man who had walked into this town, searching for redemption. He was a man who had found it, not in the wealth he had lost, but in the life he had created and the love that had blossomed in the most unexpected of places. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "Yes," Claire replied, her hand still in his, her voice full of promise. "Just the beginning." And as they stepped inside, the doors closing softly behind them, William realized that the community center wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. Together, they would continue to build a life, build a future, build a love that could withstand anything. The journey ahead was theirs to create, and with Claire by his side, William knew he had everything he needed to make it extraordinary. Months passed, and the community center became everything they had hoped for, and more. It wasn't just a place for events or classes. It was a hub of connection, a place where people came together not just to learn or grow, but to support one another. William watched with a sense of fulfillment as the center transformed lives, just as it had transformed his own. And through it all, Claire remained by his side. The two of them, once strangers to one another, had built a life that was rooted in something far deeper than they could have imagined. Love had blossomed between them, not from grand gestures or promises, but from the quiet moments of trust and shared purpose. William's transformation wasn't just about what he had lost or gained. It was about the simple truth that sometimes the things we need most aren't the things we've been chasing. Sometimes they're the things we least expect. The people who show up when we're ready, the connections that change us, and the love that helps us see who we truly are. As the community center continued to grow and thrive, so too did William and Claire's bond. They no longer looked back at what had been lost, but forward toward a future that was full of promise. Together, they had built something that would last, something that would live on, not just in the walls of the center, but in the hearts of the people it served. And in the quiet of those nights, when the work was done and the lights dimmed, William would often look at Claire, his heart full, and know that the greatest treasure he had found wasn't something that could be measured in money or success. It was something far richer. It was love, and it was all they needed to begin their new journey. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.